Picture this. You are standing in the sacred halls of the Vatican in the year 855 AD, witnessing what you believe to be another ordinary papal ceremony. The incense burns, the Latin chants echo through marble corridors, and before you stands a figure draped in holy robes, blessing the faithful masses. But what you don't know, what no one in that crowd knows, is that beneath those sacred vestments lies the most dangerous secret in Christian history. The Pope blessing you isn't a man at all. Her name is Joan, and for over 2 years she has ruled the Catholic Church as the most powerful woman in medieval Europe, hiding her true identity behind carefully constructed lies that would shake the foundations of faith itself. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and deception, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of medieval intrigue. It's the story of how one woman's desperate quest for knowledge led her to commit the ultimate act of sacrilege, deceiving an entire civilization about her very existence. The name Pope Joan might sound like legend to you, but her story was recorded by medieval chroniclers as historical fact, only to be systematically erased by a church desperate to hide its most embarrassing truth. Let's start with the girl who would become the architect of Christianity's greatest deception. Joan wasn't born into power or privilege. Historical accounts place her birth around 822 AD in the village of Ingelheim near Mainz to a family of modest means. But from her earliest years, something burned inside this child that terrified her parents, an insatiable hunger for learning that was considered not just inappropriate, but actively dangerous for a girl in the 9th century. Picture this. You're a 12-year-old girl in medieval Europe, and you've just been caught reading Latin manuscripts in secret. Your father's hand strikes your face with such force that blood runs from your nose, staining the precious parchment below. "Women who read," he snarls, "are tools of the devil." But as you wipe the blood away, your eyes never leave the text. Because you've discovered something more powerful than fear, more addictive than safety, knowledge itself. And you're willing to sacrifice everything, including your very identity, to possess it. Joan's obsession with learning began when a traveling monk named Martin took pity on the bright young girl and began teaching her to read Latin in secret. What Martin thought was harmless charity became the spark that would ignite a deception spanning decades. Joan devoured every text she could find, theological treatises, philosophical works, medical manuscripts, absorbing knowledge with a hunger that her teacher found both impressive and deeply unsettling. But 9th century Europe had no place for learned women. The church taught that female intelligence was inherently corrupted by Eve's original sin, that women who pursued education were rebelling against God's natural order. Convents existed for women, yes, but they were prisons disguised as sanctuaries. Places where female minds were systematically starved of the intellectual nourishment they craved. Joan understood this reality with crystalline clarity. She could spend her life as a silent, ignorant wife, producing children and tending hearth fires. She could enter a convent and rot away in enforced ignorance. Or she could something so audacious, so impossible, that even contemplating it felt like madness. She could become a man. Imagine the moment of transformation. You're standing before a mirror in a dim monastery cell, scissors trembling in your hand as you prepare to cut away the last visible traces of your female identity. Your long hair falls to the stone floor like autumn leaves, each strand a piece of the girl you're about to murder forever. You bind your breasts with strips of linen until breathing becomes difficult, until pain becomes your constant companion. You practice walking differently, speaking differently, existing differently. Because you know that if anyone discovers your secret, they won't just kill you. They'll make your death a public spectacle that will haunt history for centuries. The mechanics of Joan's deception required planning that bordered on genius. She studied the mannerisms of young monks, learned to imitate their gait, their gestures, their patterns of speech, She practiced urinating while standing, binding her genitals to create the illusion of male anatomy. She studied voice modulation, keeping her speech in lower registers, claiming that a childhood illness had affected her vocal cords. Most crucially, she understood that the best lies contain elements of truth. She couldn't simply appear as a fully formed male scholar without explanation, so she crafted a backstory that was both believable and impossible to verify. She claimed to be Johannes Anglicus, a young man from England whose family had died in Viking raids. This explained her slight accent, her lack of local connections, and her desperate need for church protection. The monastery of Fulda accepted this supposed refugee without suspicion. In 9th century Europe, Viking raids were common, displaced scholars were numerous, and the church prided itself on offering sanctuary to the educated homeless. Joan's exceptional intelligence, which had once marked her as dangerous, now served as her greatest asset. Within months, she had gained a reputation as one of the most promising young theologians in the monastery. But living as a man required constant vigilance that wore at her sanity. She couldn't undress in front of others. She couldn't bathe communally. She had to simulate male bodily functions while hiding female ones. When her monthly bleeding began, she had to find ways to dispose of bloodied cloths without arousing suspicion, claiming stomach ailments that required frequent private time. You've been living as a man for 3 years now, and you've almost forgotten what it felt like to exist as yourself. Almost. But then, one night in the scriptorium, copying manuscripts by candlelight, you catch a glimpse of your reflection in the window glass. For just a moment you see her, the girl you used to be, staring back at you like a ghost. Your hand trembles, ink splattering across the precious parchment. Brother Marcus looks up from his own work. "Are you well, Johannes?" he asks, and you realize that the most terrifying part isn't the fear of being discovered. It's the growing fear that Johannes is becoming more real than Joan ever was. Joan's reputation for brilliance spread beyond Fulda's walls. She was invited to participate in theological debates, to lecture at other monasteries, to engage with the greatest minds of her era. Each success deepened her deception, but also increased her danger. The higher she rose in church hierarchy, the more scrutiny she faced, the more opportunities for her secret to be discovered. She developed relationships with other monks that were simultaneously genuine and completely fraudulent. She felt real affection for men who knew her only as Johannes, who would have been horrified to learn they were befriending a woman. These friendships became sources of both comfort and agony. She was loved for being someone she wasn't, while the person she actually was remained invisible and unknowable. The psychological toll was enormous. Joan began experiencing what modern psychology would recognize as dissociative episodes, moments when the boundaries between her true self and her male persona became blurred. She would sometimes forget to respond to the name Joan in her private thoughts, would catch herself automatically adopting masculine mannerisms, even when alone. Her relationship with sexuality became incredibly complex. She was attracted to men, but couldn't pursue romantic relationships without exposing her secret. She experienced desire, but had to suppress it completely, knowing that any sexual contact would reveal her true anatomy. She lived in a state of enforced celibacy that went far beyond what was required of male clergy. They chose celibacy for spiritual reasons, while she endured it as a survival necessity. It's been 7 years since you became Johannes, and today you're being summoned to Rome itself. Pope Leo IV has requested your presence at the Vatican, having heard reports of your exceptional theological insights. As your cart approaches the Eternal City, you see the dome of St. Peter's Basilica rising before you like a mountain of marble and gold. You should feel triumph. You, a village girl, are about to enter the highest circles of Christian power. Instead, you feel terror so pure it tastes like metal in your mouth. Because you know that in Rome, surrounded by the most learned and suspicious men in Christendom, one mistake will mean not just death, but eternal damnation in the eyes of history. Joan's arrival in Rome marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of her deception. The Vatican was an environment of political intrigue, theological scholarship, and constant surveillance. Cardinals and bishops watched each other for signs of heresy, weakness, or scandal. The scholarly debates were more intense, the examinations more rigorous, the stakes immeasurably higher. Yet Joan not only survived, but thrived. Her genuine brilliance shone in theological discussions. Her insights into canon law impressed the most learned cardinals. Her ability to read and interpret texts in multiple languages marked her as exceptionally gifted. Within months, she had become one of Pope Leo IV's most trusted advisors. The irony was overwhelming. Here was a woman, forbidden by church doctrine from even speaking in religious gatherings, now helping to shape the policies that would govern millions of Christian souls. She participated in debates about women's spiritual capabilities while hiding her own female identity. She helped craft rules about celibacy while living a celibacy more complete than any man's. Pope Leo IV's death in 855 AD created an opportunity that Joan could never have imagined. The College of Cardinals was deadlocked over his successor. The papal politics of the 9th century were notoriously complex, with different factions supporting different candidates based on political rather than spiritual considerations. In this chaos, several cardinals began floating the name of Johannes Anglicus as a compromise candidate. You're sitting in the Sistine Chapel as the cardinals debate the papal succession, and you hear your false name being mentioned as a serious candidate. Your heart pounds so loudly, you're certain the men around you can hear it over their whispered conversations. Cardinal Anastasius leans forward. Johannes has the theological knowledge of a doctor, the political neutrality of an outsider, and the moral authority of a true scholar. You want to scream, to confess, to end this madness before it goes too far. But you also realize you're closer to absolute power than any woman in history has ever been. The choice you make in the next few moments will either fulfill your wildest dreams or create your most horrific nightmare. The conclave that elected Pope Joan was relatively brief by medieval standards. Her reputation for learning, combined with her perceived political neutrality, made her an attractive compromise candidate. On a summer day in 855 AD, the cardinals announced their choice. Johannes Anglicus would become Pope John VIII. Joan's coronation was attended by thousands of faithful Christians who believed they were witnessing the elevation of a holy man to the throne of St. Peter. The woman standing beneath the papal crown knew she was committing what the church would consider the ultimate sacrilege, not just deceiving the faithful, but allowing herself to be seen as Christ's representative on earth while hiding her true nature. The first months of Joan's papacy were marked by competent, even inspired leadership. She issued decrees that demonstrated deep theological understanding. She managed the complex political relationships between the papacy and various European kingdoms with skill. Her sermons were noted for their spiritual insight and scholarly depth, but the psychological pressure of her position was beyond human endurance. She was literally impersonating God's voice on earth while knowing that her very existence violated everything the church taught about women's spiritual capabilities. Every Mass she celebrated was an act of blasphemy. Every blessing she gave was tainted by deception. Every prayer she offered carried the weight of her impossible secret. You're alone in the papal chambers, wearing the sacred vestments that have been blessed by centuries of holy men, and you're staring at your reflection in a silver mirror. The papal crown sits heavy on your head, its jewels catching the candlelight like stars. For just a moment, you allow yourself to lower your voice to its natural register, to soften your features, to remember what it felt like to be Joan. I am a woman, you whisper to your reflection, the words feeling like both confession and prayer. I am a woman, and I am the Pope. The contradiction feels like it might tear your soul apart. Joan's downfall began, ironically, with love. Despite years of enforced celibacy, despite the impossible circumstances of her life, she found herself drawn to a young cardinal named Lambert. Their relationship began as intellectual collaboration. Lambert was one of the few men in the Vatican whose scholarship could match her own. But prolonged contact, shared late-night discussions about theology and philosophy, and the terrible isolation of her secret life gradually transformed professional respect into something deeper and more dangerous. The relationship remained chaste for months. Joan understood that any physical intimacy would expose her secret immediately. But human nature has its limits, and after years of complete emotional isolation, the temptation to connect with another person became overwhelming. Their first kiss happened in the papal library, surrounded by manuscripts that contained 1,000 years of Christian wisdom. Lambert believed he was embracing a holy man who had succumbed to forbidden desires. Joan knew she was experiencing her first moment of genuine intimacy in over a decade of deception. What followed was a sexual relationship that defied every category of medieval sin. Joan experienced physical pleasure while knowing that discovery would mean death for both of them. Lambert believed he was committing sodomy with the Pope, unaware that he was actually having heterosexual relations with a woman. The theological implications were so complex that medieval minds would have struggled to classify the exact nature of their transgression. You wake up in Lambert's arms on a cold February morning, his breathing warm against your neck. For the first time in 15 years, you feel completely yourself. Not Johannes the scholar, not John the Pope, but Joan the woman. His hand rests on your breast, and you realize that in sleep, your careful binding has loosened. If he wakes now, if he opens his eyes and truly sees what he's touching, everything ends. Your papacy ends. Your life ends. History itself will never recover from the scandal. But for these few precious moments, you allow yourself to exist as you truly are, knowing it may be the last time you ever feel this human. The inevitable happened with brutal swiftness. Joan discovered she was pregnant in the spring of 856 AD, barely 8 months into her papal reign. The irony was crushing. The woman who had spent years hiding her female nature was now carrying the most obvious proof of her gender imaginable. Medieval understanding of pregnancy was limited, but Joan knew she had perhaps 6 months before her condition became visible. 6 months to find a solution to an impossible problem. She couldn't claim divine intervention. That would be blasphemy beyond imagination. She couldn't disappear without explanation. Popes don't simply vanish. She couldn't confess the truth. That would destroy not just her life, but the faith of millions. She began making subtle preparations for abdication, claiming that she felt called to a life of hermitage and contemplation. But the College of Cardinals resistant. Pope John VIII was popular, effective, and still young by papal standards. They saw no reason why he should abandon his sacred duties for personal spiritual quests. As her pregnancy advanced, Joan became increasingly desperate. She commissioned loose-fitting vestments, claiming that ascetic practices had caused weight loss that made her traditional robes uncomfortable. She reduced her public appearances, delegating more responsibilities to cardinals. She spent long hours in private prayer, ostensibly for spiritual reasons, actually struggling with morning sickness and the growing changes in her body. You're celebrating Easter Mass in 857 AD, standing before thousands of faithful Christians, your pregnant belly hidden beneath layers of sacred robes. As you lift the communion host and speak the words of consecration, "This is my body," you feel your child kick inside your womb. The irony is so profound it feels like divine mockery. You're transforming bread into Christ's flesh while carrying new life in your own flesh, performing the Church's most sacred ritual while embodying its greatest scandal. The Latin words taste like ash in your mouth as you realize that this may be your last Mass, your final moment as the most powerful religious figure in the world. Joan's labor began on a May morning in 857 AD during a papal procession through the streets of Rome. She had calculated carefully, believing she had several more weeks before the birth. But medieval obstetrics was primitive, and first pregnancies were unpredictable. The contractions started as the procession moved between the Colosseum and St. Clement's Basilica. Joan initially tried to ignore the pain, maintaining her papal dignity while agony ripped through her body. But as the contractions intensified, she could no longer hide her distress. Contemporary accounts describe the scene with horrified fascination. The Pope suddenly doubled over in apparent agony, his face pale and sweating. Cardinals rushed to his aid, assuming he was suffering from some sudden illness. But as they helped remove his outer vestments, the truth became impossible to hide. Pope John VIII was giving birth. The revelation that followed was perhaps the most shocking moment in medieval European history. Thousands of witnesses saw their spiritual father revealed as a woman in labor. The sacred and the biological collided in a spectacle that challenged every assumption about divine authority, female nature, and the foundations of Christian civilization. The crowd's roar changes in an instant from reverent murmurs to screams of horror and rage. You're lying in the Roman street, your papal robes torn away, your swollen belly and female anatomy exposed to thousands of eyes. The child, crowning between your legs, is the physical proof of your deception, but it's the looks on the faces surrounding you that truly destroy you. Cardinals who trusted you stare in disgust and betrayal. Common people who believed you were God's representative now see you as the devil's bride. Your child's first cry mingles with shouts of heretic and witch. You realize that in bringing life into the world, you've signed both your death warrants. What happened next remains debated by historians, but the most credible accounts suggest that both Joan and her newborn child died within hours. Some sources claim the crowd stoned them to death in their rage. Others suggest that Joan died from complications of childbirth, with her infant following shortly after. A few accounts hint that church officials quickly spirited them away and executed them in private to avoid further public scandal. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The revelation that a woman had served as pope for over 2 years sent shockwaves throughout Christian Europe. Letters flew between monasteries, kingdoms, and theological centers as the implications became clear. If the pope could be a woman in disguise, what other assumptions about divine authority might be false? The church's response was swift and comprehensive. Within weeks, Pope Joan's papacy was being systematically erased from official records. Her papal decrees were rescinded. Her name was removed from papal lists. Churches she had consecrated were reconsecrated. Every trace of her reign was methodically destroyed. But the people who witnessed her revelation couldn't have their memories erased. For generations, Romans passed down stories of the female pope who gave birth in the street. These oral traditions preserved details that official histories tried to eliminate. Years pass, and you might think Joan's story ends with her death in that Roman street. But you would be wrong, because the Catholic Church, in its desperate attempts to erase her from history, inadvertently ensured her immortality. They instituted new papal traditions specifically designed to prevent another Joan, ceremonies where the Pope's male anatomy was physically verified before coronation. They created gaps in official papal chronologies that medieval chroniclers couldn't help but notice and investigate. Every attempt to hide her story only made it more fascinating to those who sought historical truth. The legend of Pope Joan spread throughout medieval Europe despite official church denials. Chronicles written in monasteries from England to Germany recorded her story as historical fact. The 13th century chronicler Martin of Troppau included her in his influential papal history. Jean de Mailly wrote detailed accounts of her reign and death. Medieval art began depicting her story in manuscripts and church carvings. The moral lessons were complex. She was simultaneously seen as a cautionary tale about female ambition and deception, and as proof of women's intellectual capabilities. Some feminists of later centuries would claim her as an early example of female achievement, while others argued that her deception ultimately reinforced negative stereotypes about women's trustworthiness. The Church's continued denials only fueled more interest in her story. Renaissance scholars investigated papal records, noting suspicious gaps and inconsistencies in official chronologies. Reformist movements used her legend as evidence of papal corruption and institutional dishonesty. Modern historians debate whether Pope Joan was a historical figure or a medieval legend that crystallized popular anxieties about female power and religious authority. The evidence is circumstantial, but compelling. Medieval chroniclers with no obvious motive to fabricate recorded her story as fact, and the Church's defensive reactions suggest they were responding to something more substantial than pure fiction. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Joan's story isn't her deception or even her tragic death. It's how completely the most powerful institution in medieval Europe was able to erase a person's existence from official history. If you walked into the Vatican today and asked about Pope Joan, official church historians would tell you she never existed, that she's merely a medieval legend with no basis in fact. But somewhere in those ancient archives, locked away from public view, There may still be documents that tell a different story. Records that prove a woman once held the keys to the kingdom of heaven and commanded the souls of millions, if only for 2 brief, impossible years. The implications of Joan's story extend far beyond medieval history. Her life represents the extreme lengths to which capable women were forced to go to access education and power in societies that denied them both. She achieved the impossible by becoming invisible, gaining ultimate authority by destroying her authentic self. Her story also reveals the profound anxieties that surrounded female intelligence and ambition in medieval Europe. The idea that a woman could possess the theological knowledge necessary to lead the church was so threatening that it had to be systematically erased from memory. Joan's abilities weren't questioned. What was deemed impossible was that such abilities could exist in a female mind. The psychological cost of her deception offers insights into the modern phenomenon of imposter syndrome, though Joan's situation was literally a matter of life and death. She spent years believing that she was fundamentally unworthy of the respect and authority she had earned through her own abilities, knowing that her gender alone would disqualify her from positions her intellect had proven she could handle. As you finish hearing Joan's story, consider this. In 2019, the Vatican's official position remained that women cannot be ordained as priests because they cannot represent Christ, who was male. 900 years after Joan's death, the same institution still maintains that female anatomy disqualifies someone from spiritual authority, regardless of their knowledge, wisdom, or calling. Joan's deception was extreme, but perhaps the real question isn't why she felt compelled to hide her gender. It's why an institution supposedly based on love and spiritual truth continues to find female identity incompatible with divine authority. Joan's legacy lives in every woman who has ever felt she needed to minimize her femininity to be taken seriously, every person who has ever hidden fundamental aspects of their identity to access opportunities that should have been freely available. Her story reminds us that behind every historical narrative of male achievement, there may be hidden stories of women whose contributions were erased, whose capabilities were denied, and whose very existence was deemed too threatening to acknowledge. The next time you hear someone claim that women weren't capable of intellectual achievement in earlier historical periods, remember Pope Joan. Remember that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It may simply be evidence of successful erasure. Remember that the most dangerous stories are often the ones institutions work hardest to forget. Joan died in a Roman street over 1,000 years ago, but her ghost still haunts the marble corridors of power. In every boardroom where women are excluded, in every institution that questions female competence, in every place where capability is deemed incompatible with femininity, Joan's spirit whispers the same message she carried to her grave. Women have always been capable of everything we've been told we couldn't do. The only question is whether we'll continue accepting the lies that keep us from trying. What did you think of this forgotten chapter of history? Have you ever had to hide parts of your identity to gain access to opportunities? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing your perspectives on these hidden stories that challenge everything we think we know about the past. And if this story moved you, there are so many more untold histories waiting to be discovered. The past is full of secrets that the powerful tried to bury, but truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at erasure.